The British Empire, an empire of oceans and contradictions, a kingdom of small islands that somehow reached every continent. For centuries of ambition carved into crowded ports, lonely frontier forts, tropical plantations, frozen outposts, and sea lanes that stitched together half the world. Kings imagined it. Merchants financed it. Sailors expanded it. Soldiers defended it. Colonists settled it. Revolutionaries challenged it. Millions of ordinary people, from London to Lagos, from Calcutta to Kingston, from Sydney to Cape Town, shaped it in ways no king or parliament ever fully controlled. Through triumph and tragedy, innovation and exploitation, prosperity and suffering, the British Empire became one of the most influential and controversial forces in human history. Its people were every bit as contradictory as the empire they built. Restless, opportunistic, inventive, stubborn. They crossed oceans in search of fortune, faith, freedom, or survival. Some arrived as explorers, others as traders, convicts, administrators, missionaries, or soldiers. Many believed they were spreading civilization. Many others experienced conquest, dispossession, famine, enslavement, or foreign rule. Few empires have left behind a legacy so vast, so complicated, or so fiercely debated. For centuries, historians have tried to piece together that story through faded maps, weathered journals, royal decrees, naval logbooks, forgotten paintings, and photographs that captured only fragments of an empire that once claimed the sun never set upon its lands. But now, using advanced AI techniques to breathe new life into historical artwork and archival imagery, we can travel through those vanished worlds with a level of realism that previous generations could only imagine. Bustling colonial ports, towering East Indiamen crossing impossible oceans, crowded imperial capitals, distant battlefields, royal ceremonies, and the everyday lives of millions who lived beneath the Union Jack all come back into view. From a damp island kingdom on the edge of Europe to the largest empire the world has ever seen. From fragile trading posts on unfamiliar shores to dominion over nearly a quarter of the Earth's land and population. From astonishing industrial wealth and global influence to world wars, independence movements, and the peaceful dismantling of an empire that once appeared eternal. This is the complete story of the British Empire. It is not simply a story of conquest. It is a story of commerce and technology, of migration and resistance, of extraordinary ambition and devastating consequences. It shaped borders that still exist today, created global trade networks that transformed civilization, spread languages, institutions, and ideas across continents, and left wounds and legacies that continue to define international politics, culture, and identity well into the 21st century. This is the rise, the expansion, the triumph, the controversy, and the decline of an empire that changed the course of world history more profoundly than perhaps any other. Let's begin at the beginning. Long before Britain ruled the oceans, before English even existed as a language, before London became the heart of an empire, these islands were home to dozens of Celtic peoples. By around 800 BC, much of Britain was inhabited by tribes whose lives revolved around farming, livestock, trade, and fiercely defended hill forts scattered across the landscape. They were not one united nation but a patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own rulers, customs, and rivalries. Yet together they laid the first cultural foundations of what would one day become Britain. The people the Romans would eventually call the Britons traded tin from Cornwall, wool from their farms, salt from coastal settlements, and metals mined from the hills. Their rivers served as highways. Their forests covered much of the land. Their priests, the Druids, held enormous spiritual authority, preserving traditions through memory rather than writing. To later generations they would seem mysterious, but to themselves, this was simply home. Everything changed in AD 43. Across the English Channel, the Roman Emperor Claudius wanted military glory. Britain offered exactly that. For Roman legions, around 40,000 professional soldiers supported by thousands of auxiliaries, crossed the sea and began one of the most successful invasions in Roman history. Discipline, engineering, and relentless organization overwhelmed tribe after tribe as Rome steadily expanded its grip over southern Britain. The conquest was never entirely peaceful. Some tribes resisted with astonishing determination. None became more famous than the Iceni queen Boudica, who in AD 60 or 61 led a massive uprising after Roman officials abused her family and seized her kingdom. Her warriors burned Roman settlements to the ground, including the young, trading town of Londinium. For a brief moment, Roman Britain seemed ready to collapse. It didn't. Roman discipline prevailed. Boudica's rebellion was crushed, and Rome responded not by abandoning Britain, but by building it. Roads stretched across the countryside with remarkable precision. Stone forts guarded frontiers. Villas appeared across fertile farmland. Aqueducts, bathhouses, temples, markets, and carefully planned towns transformed much of southern Britain into one of Rome's most prosperous provinces. Among those growing settlements was Londinium, founded shortly after the invasion beside the River Thames. Its location made it an ideal trading hub, connecting Britain to the wider Roman world. Merchants from across the empire unloaded wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, fine pottery from Italy, and luxury goods from as far away as North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. No one living in Roman Londinium could possibly have imagined that this busy provincial town would one day become the capital of the largest empire the world had ever seen. But the first foundations had been laid. By the late 1500s, England stood in a precarious position. Queen Elizabeth I had broken decisively with Catholic Rome. English privateers were attacking Spanish treasure fleets across the Atlantic, and support for Dutch rebels fighting Spanish rule had turned political rivalry into open hostility. Across Europe, many believed England's days as an independent Protestant kingdom were numbered. Then, in 1588, came the greatest threat the nation had ever faced. King Philip II of Spain assembled what was, at the time, the most powerful naval expedition the world had ever seen. Around 130 ships, carrying nearly 30,000 sailors and soldiers, sailed from Spain with a simple objective: seize control of the English Channel, escort an invasion army from the Spanish Netherlands, and overthrow Elizabeth's government. England wasn't just facing defeat. It faced conquest. Fear spread across the country. Beacons were prepared along the coastline. Militias gathered in towns and villages. Church bells rang with urgent warnings as anxious families waited for news from the sea. If the Armada succeeded, England's political future, its religion, and perhaps even its identity could disappear in a single campaign. Yet the story was about to hinge on a handful of remarkable decisions and a great deal of fortune. England's navy, commanded by experienced seamen such as Lord Howard of Effingham and Francis Drake, refused to fight Spain on its terms. Rather than closing for boarding actions, English captains used faster, more maneuverable ships to harass the Armada from a distance, slowly wearing down the massive formation. Then, under cover of darkness near Calais, they unleashed fireships into the tightly packed Spanish fleet. Panic spread. Anchors were cut. Carefully organized formations dissolved into confusion. The decisive battle came off Gravelines. English gunfire scattered the Armada even further, but the final blow came from an enemy neither side could command: the weather. Powerful Atlantic storms battered the damaged fleet as it attempted to sail around Scotland and Ireland to return home. Ships smashed against unforgiving coastlines. Thousands drowned in freezing seas. Of the mighty Armada that had set sail only months earlier, barely two-thirds limped back to Spain. Across Protestant England, many believed divine intervention had saved the kingdom. Medals were struck bearing the famous inscription, "God blew," and they were scattered. Whether miracle or meteorology, the consequences were enormous. England had survived its greatest existential crisis. More importantly, it had discovered something that would shape the next 4 centuries of history. Mastery of the sea could protect a small island kingdom against even the mightiest empire on earth. That lesson would become the foundation upon which the British Empire itself was built. England's escape from the Spanish Armada secured its future, but building an empire would take centuries. First, the kingdom itself had to survive the brutal trials of the Middle Ages, an era when disasters seemed to arrive with relentless regularity. The first blow came from nature. Beginning in 1315, years of relentless rain ruined harvests across much of northern Europe. Fields became waterlogged. Grain failed to ripen. Livestock died from disease and starvation. What became known as the Great Famine lasted for years, driving food prices to extraordinary levels. For ordinary families across England, bread became a luxury. Thousands abandoned their homes searching for food. Malnutrition weakened entire communities, leaving the population vulnerable to whatever came next. It didn't have long to wait. In 1337, England and France entered what would become the 100 Years' War, a conflict that, despite its name, lasted 116 years. Generations of Englishmen would know almost nothing except taxation, military campaigns, and uncertainty. Victories such as Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt created moments of national pride, but war demanded enormous resources. Kings borrowed heavily, villages lost their young men, and trade was repeatedly disrupted as armies marched across France and pirates preyed upon merchant shipping. Then came the greatest catastrophe of them all. In 1348, ships arriving from continental Europe carried an invisible passenger, the Black Death. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread primarily by fleas living on rats, the plague raced through England with terrifying speed. There was no cure, no understanding of how it spread, and almost no escape. Entire households disappeared within days. Churchyards overflowed with hastily dug graves. Markets stood silent. Fields went untilled because there was no one left to harvest them. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between a third and one-half of England's population perished in only a few years. Few events in British history have matched its scale. The survivors inherited a country fundamentally transformed. With labor suddenly scarce, surviving workers found themselves able to demand higher wages. Landowners resisted. Parliament attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels through new laws, but economic reality could not be legislated away. Tensions simmered between rulers and ordinary people. Eventually, it erupted. In 1381, thousands of peasants marched on London in one of the most dramatic popular uprisings medieval England had ever witnessed. They demanded lower taxes, an end to serfdom, and greater freedom. For several extraordinary days, royal officials were hunted through the streets before the rebellion was finally crushed. Famine, endless war, plague, rebellion. Again and again, medieval England seemed ready to collapse beneath the weight of catastrophe. Yet somehow it endured. And from that battered kingdom, scarred but still standing, a new England was beginning to emerge. One that would soon produce an unlikely dynasty capable of changing not just Britain, but the entire world. By the middle of the 16th century, England was still far from being a great power. Spain possessed the richest empire on earth. Portugal controlled the sea route to Asia. The Ottoman Empire dominated the eastern Mediterranean. England was a relatively poor kingdom on the edge of Europe, divided by religious conflict and surrounded by far stronger rivals. Then, in 1558, an unlikely ruler inherited the throne. Elizabeth Tudor was just 25 years old. Her mother and Boleyn had been executed when Elizabeth was a child. During the reign of her Catholic half-sister Mary I, she had spent time imprisoned in the Tower of London under suspicion of treason. Many foreign rulers doubted she would survive, let alone rule successfully. A woman governing alone in 16th-century Europe was considered an extraordinary gamble. Yet somehow she did. Elizabeth possessed something far more valuable than overwhelming military strength: patience. She avoided costly continental wars whenever possible, stabilized England's fractured religious settlement, strengthened the royal treasury, and surrounded herself with remarkably capable advisors, including William Cecil and Francis Walsingham. While Europe's great powers exhausted themselves in endless conflict, England quietly grew stronger. She also encouraged a new generation of ambitious seafarers. Men like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, and Martin Frobisher sailed farther than English captains ever had before. Officially, they were explorers and merchants. Unofficially, many were privateers, licensed by the crown to attack Spanish shipping. Silver, gold, and cargo captured from Spain flowed back into English ports, enriching investors and teaching English sailors how to fight, navigate, and survive on the open ocean. These voyages did more than embarrass Spain. They changed England's imagination. For the first time, English merchants and nobles began looking beyond Europe. Across the Atlantic lay fisheries, fertile land, and opportunities that seemed almost limitless. In 1585, Raleigh sponsored one of England's earliest attempts to establish a permanent colony on Roanoke Island. The settlement ultimately vanished, earning its enduring nickname, the Lost Colony, but the idea behind it survived. England would not remain confined to its own shores forever. When Elizabeth died in 1603 after 44 years on the throne, she left behind a kingdom that was wealthier, more confident, and vastly more experienced at sea than the one she had inherited. She had not created the British Empire herself. Few people of her generation could even imagine its eventual scale. But she had done something just as important. She transformed England from a vulnerable European kingdom into an outward-looking maritime nation. She gave its merchants confidence, its sailors experience, and its rulers the belief that the sea was not a barrier separating Britain from the world. It was the road that would eventually allow Britain to rule it. As England's colonies expanded during the 17th century, wealth poured into the kingdom from sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities grown thousands of miles away. But behind that prosperity lay a system of unimaginable human suffering. It began with labor. European settlers quickly discovered that plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas demanded an enormous workforce. At first, many relied on indentured servants from Britain, but the supply was limited and temporary. Plantation owners wanted workers they could control for life. Increasingly, they turned to the transatlantic slave trade. What followed became one of the largest forced migrations in human history. British ships sailed to the west coast of Africa, carrying manufactured goods. There, traders purchased captive men, women, and children from African intermediaries or through wars and raids fueled by the growing demand for slaves. The captives were then packed into the holds of slave ships for the terrifying journey across the Atlantic, a voyage that became known as the Middle Passage. Conditions were almost beyond comprehension. Hundreds of people were chained together below deck in spaces so cramped they could barely move. Disease spread rapidly through the suffocating air. Food and fresh water were rationed. Those who resisted were beaten. Some chose to throw themselves into the ocean rather than face a lifetime of slavery. Historians estimate that around 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic, and roughly 3 million voyages were carried out by British ships alone over the course of Britain's involvement. Millions more died before ever reaching the plantations. Those who survived found no freedom awaiting them. On sugar estates in Jamaica, Barbados, and other Caribbean colonies, enslaved people worked from dawn until nightfall under brutal conditions. Families were separated. Punishments were severe. Human beings were bought, sold, inherited, and treated as property under colonial law. The immense profits generated by their labor helped finance Britain's growing banks, ports, factories, and global trading networks. For generations, this system became deeply embedded within the British Empire itself. Yet resistance never disappeared. Enslaved people rebelled aboard ships, escaped into remote communities, sabotaged plantations, preserved their cultures, and fought constantly against the system that sought to dehumanize them. At the same time, voices inside Britain slowly began condemning the trade as morally indefensible, setting the stage for one of the empire's greatest political battles. The British Empire was becoming richer than ever before. But beneath its extraordinary wealth stood millions of lives stolen by one of history's greatest injustices. It was a contradiction the empire could not ignore forever. No single king created the British Empire. Instead, one of the greatest engines of imperial expansion began as something far more ordinary, a private company. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants, giving them exclusive rights to trade with the East Indies. It was called the East India Company. At first, its ambitions seemed modest. Its ships sought spices, silk, cotton, tea, and porcelain from Asia. It established trading posts where local rulers permitted them, negotiated commercial agreements, and competed with Dutch and Portuguese merchants for access to the world's richest markets. But over time, trade became power. The company built fortified ports. It hired soldiers to protect its warehouses. Then it hired more soldiers to protect the first soldiers. Before long, it possessed its own navy, its own diplomats, its own tax collectors, and eventually one of the largest private armies in history. By the mid-18th century, The East India Company employed hundreds of thousands of Indian troops, far more than the British Army itself. The turning point came in 1757. At the Battle of Plassey, company forces under Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal with a combination of military skill, political intrigue, and carefully cultivated alliances. The victory handed the company control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions on earth. Enormous revenues flowed back to Britain, financing banks, factories, and investors while transforming London into the financial center of a rapidly expanding empire. The company was no longer simply trading with Asia. It was ruling it. Roads were built, ports expanded, courts, administrative systems, and commercial networks spread across vast territories. British merchants gained access to markets unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Tea became a national obsession. Cotton fueled Britain's textile mills during the Industrial Revolution. Fortunes were made on a scale previously unimaginable. Yet the company's success carried a devastating cost. Its administrators frequently placed profit ahead of people. Heavy taxation burdened farming communities. Local industries were disrupted by imperial trade policies. Corruption became widespread, and during the Bengal famine of 1770, millions died amid catastrophic food shortages while the company's administration struggled to respond effectively. Critics increasingly questioned whether a private corporation should possess the power to govern millions of people. The East India Company had become a paradox. It helped build the commercial foundations of the British Empire while simultaneously exposing its deepest moral contradictions. It generated extraordinary wealth, but also extraordinary suffering. It expanded Britain's influence across Asia, yet sowed resentment that would grow stronger with every passing generation. Eventually, even the British government realized the company had become too powerful to control. Its greatest triumph was already beginning to contain the seeds of its downfall. By the early 19th century, Britain had defeated Napoleon, dominated global trade, and possessed colonies on every inhabited continent. But ruling a worldwide empire presented a challenge unlike anything history had seen. Distance. An empire stretching from Canada to Australia, from India to the Caribbean, could not survive on armies alone. It needed something capable of connecting oceans, protecting commerce, suppressing rebellions, and projecting power thousands of miles from home. The answer was the Royal Navy. Throughout the 19th century, Britain transformed its navy into the most powerful maritime force the world had ever known. Wooden sailing ships gave way to steam-powered ironclads. Telegraph cables stretched beneath the oceans, allowing London to communicate with distant colonies in hours rather than months. Coaling stations were established from Gibraltar to Malta, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong, Cape Town, and countless smaller ports, creating a chain of imperial lifelines that allowed British warships to reach almost any corner of the globe. Every new harbor, dockyard, and naval base appeared to serve commerce. But they served another purpose as well. Like the broad boulevards of Haussmann's Paris, Britain's global naval network was designed for control. Merchant ships could travel safely under naval protection. Potential rivals could be blockaded before they became dangerous. Colonial uprisings could be confronted rapidly by forces arriving from the sea. Wherever vital trade routes existed, British warships were rarely far away. The oceans themselves became Britain's highways. This system carried extraordinary benefits. International trade expanded to unprecedented levels. Goods, mail, passengers, and investment flowed across continents with increasing speed and reliability. British engineering connected markets that had once seemed impossibly distant, accelerating the first truly global economy. Yet maintaining that network demanded sacrifices rarely remembered today. Ports were fortified. Indigenous communities were displaced to make way for strategic naval installations. Colonial governments increasingly shaped local economies around imperial priorities rather than local needs. Around the world, countless people found themselves living beside military bases they had never asked for, governed by decisions made in London thousands of miles away. To many Britons, the empire represented order, stability, and free trade. To many living under imperial rule, the same network represented surveillance, occupation, and foreign control. That contradiction defined Britain's imperial century. The Royal Navy did far more than defend the British Empire. It reorganized the geography of global power itself, turning the world's oceans into an interconnected imperial system. It was an astonishing achievement of logistics, engineering, and organization, but one built to ensure that, wherever the Union Jack flew, Britain's authority could reach it long before any challenge to its rule could do the same. By 1939, the British Empire had reached a scale no empire in history had ever matched. It governed nearly a quarter of the world's land, ruled over hundreds of millions of people, and maintained military bases and naval stations across every major ocean. It looked invincible. Then the Second World War shattered that illusion. When Nazi Germany conquered much of Europe in 1940, Britain suddenly stood almost alone. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped through Dunkirk. German bombers crossed the English Channel almost daily, raining explosives on London, Liverpool, Coventry, and dozens of other cities. During the Blitz, families spent night after night sheltering in underground stations as entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath fire and rubble. Yet Britain refused to surrender. The empire itself became one enormous war machine. Soldiers arrived from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Africa, and the Caribbean. Merchant ships crossed dangerous seas carrying food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials, while German submarines hunted them relentlessly across the Atlantic. In factories from Birmingham to Bombay, millions worked around the clock to keep the Allied war effort alive. Victory eventually came, but at an extraordinary cost. By 1945, Britain had helped defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It emerged on the winning side of history, celebrated around the world for its resilience and sacrifice. Yet beneath the celebrations lay a quieter reality. The war had exhausted the empire. Britain owed enormous debts. Much of its industry required rebuilding, and maintaining a global empire had become financially unsustainable. More importantly, the conflict had transformed politics across the colonies themselves. Millions of colonial soldiers had fought for freedom overseas, while increasingly asking why that same freedom should not exist at home. The first great break came in 1947. After decades of political pressure led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and countless Indian nationalists, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan. It was one of the largest transfers of power in human history. Over the following decades, colonies across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific would follow the same path. The empire that had once expanded across the globe was now steadily retreating. By the late 20th century, the Union Jack no longer flew over most of Britain's former possessions. What remained was a voluntary commonwealth of independent nations linked by history rather than imperial rule. In winning the greatest war it had ever fought, Britain had also accelerated the end of the empire it had spent centuries building. Its greatest military triumph became the beginning of its imperial farewell. Today, the British Empire is gone. The maps that were once shaded red have faded into history books. Most of its colonies are now independent nations with their own governments, identities, and futures. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never set," belongs to another age. And yet, the empire never truly disappeared. Its fingerprints are everywhere. English became one of the world's dominant languages. Parliamentary democracy spread across continents. Common law shaped legal systems from Canada to Australia, from India to parts of Africa and the Caribbean. Railways, ports, universities, financial institutions, and administrative systems built during the imperial era continue to influence hundreds of millions of lives. So too do borders drawn in distant government offices, political conflicts left unresolved, and economic inequalities whose roots stretch back centuries. Its legacy is impossible to separate into heroes and villains. The empire accelerated global trade, scientific exchange, industrialization, and technological innovation on a scale the world had never witnessed. It also oversaw conquest, exploitation, famine, slavery, cultural destruction, and political domination that inflicted immense suffering across generations. Both stories are true. That is what makes the history of the British Empire so compelling. It survived foreign invasions, medieval famine, devastating plague, religious upheaval, civil conflict, global wars, and the greatest military threats of its age. It transformed a relatively small island kingdom into the center of an empire spanning nearly a quarter of the earth. Then, Remarkably, it dismantled that empire faster than it had built it, leaving behind not empty oceans, but a world permanently shaped by everything it had become. Modern Britain remains, in many ways, a reflection of that extraordinary journey. It is diverse, influential, innovative, proud, self-critical, sometimes nostalgic, sometimes uncomfortable with its own past. A country still debating what the empire meant, what should be remembered, what should be celebrated, and what should never be forgotten. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the British Empire. Not that it conquered so much of the world, but that its history became the history of so much of the world. Whether your ancestors lived in London, Lagos, Delhi, Kingston, Sydney, Cape Town, Singapore, Toronto, or countless other places once connected by that vast imperial network, the echoes of this story are still present today. They exist in languages we speak, institutions we inherit, borders we cross, and ideas we continue to debate. History is rarely simple. Empires are never entirely glorious, and they are never entirely monstrous. They are built by human beings, shaped by impossible choices, extraordinary ambition, remarkable achievement, profound injustice, and unintended consequences that often outlive those who created them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy exploring history in this kind of cinematic depth, seeing not just what happened, but why it still matters, consider subscribing. There are many more stories waiting to be uncovered, and every one of them helps us better understand the world we live in today.